All right. Hello again, and welcome to our panel discussion of broadband and the digital divide. I want to give a quick shout out and thanks to Eric Nealand of the Worcester Regional Research Bureau for organizing this panel. Before I turn it over to our moderator, Paul Matthews, I want to tell you a little bit about him. He was appointed Executive Director and CEO of the Worcester Regional Research Bureau nearly 2 years ago in September 2019. Prior to his appointment, for 15 years, he led the 495 Metro West Partnership, a public-private nonprofit addressing the policy and development needs of 35 communities. During his tenure, the partnership provided key policy expertise to foster collaborations between legislators, municipal officials, business executives, and other regional institutions on a wide range of issues, including transportation, economic development, workforce, housing, water resources, and infrastructure. The issue of how best to provide broadband access and close the digital divide has been a major topic of research and commentary for the Research Bureau during the past year, so we appreciate him bringing his perspective and knowledge to this panel. Take it away, Paul.
Thanks very much, Sarah, not only for those very generous comments, but also for the opportunity to facilitate today, and most importantly, for all the work you and so many other people have put into today's conference. As my first GRA conference, it's tremendously impressive, and today's panel really illustrates the value of the GRA, bringing together people, providing perspectives on a crucial issue facing all of our communities. As we all know, broadband is an absolutely crucial topic given the pandemic. And while it was clearly an issue before the pandemic, in both rural and urban areas, it was brought into stark relief by the impact of the pandemic on remote learning. Here in Massachusetts, my urban system was shut down for about a year and went remote. Remote work, a topic many GRA members experienced themselves, impact on telemedicine and civic engagement, shifting to online governmental engagement. So it's a very complicated issue, but it is one that all of our organizations can have an impact on. I don't know if there's the possibility of pumping up the slide, Sarah, that I provided, but my organization was able to utilize ACS data from 2018. Thank you. So just by way of example, these are data sources available to all of us. So the American Community Survey from 2018, we pulled broadband access and showed that our city, 33% of our city lacks a broadband internet subscription, and 18% lack an internet access point at all. This map that we used, GIS analysis to demonstrate, clearly shows the inequities and disparities in how it's spread regionally. We used FCC data to show that 99.9% of our population, and incidentally, it's the second largest city in New England, has only one choice for a wired broadband provider. I'll leave that provider nameless for obvious reasons. However, this data has led to an ongoing conversation, both within Worcester, municipal government, the school committee, and on the state level, it's fed into an ongoing examination of the urban digital divide, given the need to distribute Chromebooks and hotspots for our students caught in this bind. So there are very real opportunities here for all of you and GRA members to make an impact on this issue. Today's panel really demonstrates the wide range of actors and responses on this. We've assembled a great panel. Each is going to offer brief introductory remarks for 3 to 5 minutes. Then we're going to have a moderated Q&A, but we are absolutely going to shift to an audience Q&A for the last 20 minutes. For the audience Q&A, you can raise your hand, and then the GRA staff will cue your camera. You can ask your question directly, or if you prefer to put it in the chat, that's something that's possible as well. So as our first speaker, we have Ryan Hankins, the Executive Director of the Public Affairs Research Council of Alabama. He's held that role since 2015. He's a graduate of Harvard Business School's Strategic Perspectives in Nonprofit Management, Executive Education, and convened their online forum this year as Alabama Online, Failure to Connect. It's a week-long virtual conversation on the impact, limitations, and divides caused by their broadband network. So take it away, Ryan.
Thank you, Paul. And I am the least qualified person to be on this panel. As Paul mentioned, we host an annual, what was once called annual meeting, but it had no real business component. This year, we changed this event to annual forum to recognize that. This meeting is normally held late January and brings the governor, lawmakers, business leaders, philanthropists from across the state. We're a statewide, state-focused, state and local government-focused organization. Often those meetings are on topics that we internally have done extensive work on. So the content, either from us or from others, is just a tip of what the iceberg of what we know on that topic. Sometimes it's the conclusion of a long-term research project. Last fall, in speaking with a new board member, he made a comment to me that were the pandemic to have happened, 10, 15 years ago, we would be in a second Great Depression. And that really captured, us in the office. I think we can debate the specifics of that comment, but the larger point he was making, I think, was very, very correct. So we quickly pivoted from our original plan to shift our 2021 meeting to really about broadband and develop that Alabama Connect, Alabama Online failure to connect, with a bit of play on words there. The real failure to connect was not failing to connect people to access, but failing to connect people, the full idea of equity that people will speak on the panel about later, and to connect the various players across the state and connect the ecosystem together, not just plug a wire into a wall. What motivated us on that in part was the recognition that we've done similar work as to Paul, and we found that approximately 76% of Alabamians have a home internet subscription. Only 57% statewide, 57% of households have a high-speed connection, and that makes us 47th in the country behind Oklahoma, Alabama, Mississippi. I have no doubt when those data are updated or better data come out, we will move to 49th or 50th because of what I know that's happening in at least Mississippi and in Arkansas. Our meeting was a 5-day event, and I had the good fortune of being referred to both Angela and Christopher, so they were speakers on our panel. We covered a lot of ground, touching a lot of issues: basic identification, defining concepts, data presentations, summarizing actions taken at the state and local level, as well as some of our congressional leadership speaking. And what I learned in that context was, one, the degree of mistrust amongst actors in this space, and I don't think that's unique to Alabama by any means. I don't want to take Christopher's thunder, but recognizing that we talk about broadband, which is really a catch-all for many different related problems, and we think there may be applicable solutions to the broadband problem, but we all have a mismatch of solution to actual problem. We know that the actors, the governmental actors here in Alabama, I think are frankly primarily focusing on the provider as the end user rather than a customer. So various state aligned and even for-profit, non-profit coalitions to address these issues of access really have little to no representation of consumers, rural consumers, low-end consumers, urban consumers. The entire universe is consumed by the various providers of different types. We, like many GRA organizations, do work in Medicaid or taxes or education, things that are hot button issues, but in my almost 6-year tenure, I've never made more people mad as I did in putting this event together based on who we invited, who we did not invite. I was basically blissfully unaware of some of the vitriol I would walk into in this conversation. What I really recognized, again, was there is so much money in this conversation. There are so many players at the state and federal levels that those who are making decisions at the policy level are frankly overwhelmed. They don't understand the jargon. They don't understand the issues at play. We can't keep up with the idea of adequacy for a moving target. We don't have good data as to what access really looks like. And as Angela will talk about in a few minutes, I'm sure, the conversation that focuses just on connection, just on access, is really short-sighted. And if we meet that goal, we've not necessarily really advanced the conversation the way we think that we have. And I will yield my time to the next speaker. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks very much, Ryan, and perfect timing. Our next speaker is Daniel Anello, the CEO of Kids First Chicago. He's held that role since 2015. He's been a leader in the launch of Chicago Connected, currently the nation's largest initiative of its kind to connect 100,000 public school students to free internet to enable remote learning. It engaged out of their direct outreach to families most impacted by COVID, coupled with data analysis that demonstrated the scale of the digital divide. His leadership has been recognized by the Chicago Mayor's inaugural Medal of Honor this past year. So, Daniel, look forward to hearing your perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Paul, and thanks everyone. It's an honor actually to be here. Thank you to everyone who's kind of pulled together, Sarah, Lawrence. So I hope I can give more, a local kind of snapshot of how to implement at ground level and some of the challenges that we've run into, and happy to expound upon that as we explore more of this through the panel discussion. But just a real high level, and I think it's somewhat in the bio, but our organization, we aren't an internet broadband organization, right? We are a parent advocacy, education focused organization. And the pandemic, I think, took for us with our parent conversations. Our job is to go to parents with information, work with them directly, understand what are the biggest impediments to their kids getting the education they deserve, and then work with them directly, get them in the room to design whatever the solution's going to be. And when the pandemic hit, broadband access, which had frankly been an issue for parents and families for years, for decades, went from number 7 on the list to number 1. And for many of our parents, it wasn't even necessarily their own household, it was their neighbors. And so they were saying, hey, I might be able to go back to school in 2 weeks, but the reality is I know that the kids down the hall or down the street are not. And in addition to that, there's a whole host of things that extend beyond education that we recognize can impede a kid's education if a family's disconnected, if people can't get access to healthcare, to jobs. And so in that work back in March, we pulled together, using similar data to what Paul just showed, for Chicago, a snapshot of where Chicago was in terms of connectivity. And we glued together both the numbers of what we were seeing in the ACS data, and we also glued together that with the narratives that we were hearing directly from families. And that quickly prompted, if you flip to the slide right before this, that quickly prompted an engagement with the city and the funding community and a host of others, CPS, the ISPs themselves in Chicago, to put together what is now Chicago Connected. It's a $50 million program over 4 years. It's privately funded for the first 2 years and then becomes publicly funded thereafter. The goal is, and what we've seen from the surveys that have come back from it, which have been really, really reassuring in terms of who we're hitting, we were targeting families that had the least means and were the most vulnerable because of the pandemic. And we have seen that 30% of those who have responded, well, we sent out a survey to 25,000 participants and got 5,000 respondents back, which is unheard of. And of the Chicago Connected participants, 30% of them didn't have a broadband connection before Chicago Connected existed. We continue to add families, and we've had conversations now with more than 24 cities from across the country and internationally about the program. It is essentially paying for the entry-level internet on behalf of families that need it. And the criteria to enter at this point for Chicago is you have to have a family in Chicago Public Schools. You have to have a kid in Chicago Public Schools and qualify for free and reduced lunch, which is almost 85% of the population. And we are now expanding it to city college populations. And we also have a network of private schools that are participants in the program as well. If you flip to the next slide, this is just a snapshot of where we are today. The initial target, what we saw in terms of need from ACS data, was 100,000 students, which is roughly about 60,000 households. And we're 64,000 plus students as of a month ago, and 42,000 households. I have a feeling, my gut says we're going to end up around 75,000 students, because there are other ways that people are getting internet that may be better options for them for whatever reason. But we continue to see people sign up every week. and we expect to see a little bit of a bump as we come into the new school year. Happy to answer questions specifically about the program. Excited to be here, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Daniel, not only for the work you're doing there, but you've managed to well beat your time limit. So thank you. The next speaker is Hannah Hill, who's a principal at Boston Consulting Group. She spent much of her time over the past year focused exclusively on the digital divide. She collaborated with Common Sense Media to publish a series of reports on what it would take to close the K-12 digital divide, partnered with Comcast to better understand the barriers that limit adoption of existing K-12 sponsored programs, and supported local municipal governments on their efforts to close the digital divide. So, Hannah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Really appreciate the introduction. As you've said, we've looked at it, or I and the team at BCG have really looked at it from both the perspective, the research side, as well as the implementation side, to really understand the size and nature of the divide, what causes it, why it matters, how to overcome. And I'll say, as I talk through my remarks, some of it's been education focused and some of it has been society and household wide. So there will be a blend of the two, and I will try and specify what I'm talking about. So first, around the size and nature of the divide. When we've looked at education specifically, we've seen, back to that ACS data and other data, Paul, that you were talking about, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was about 30% of K-12 students in the US, that's 15 to 16 million students, that didn't have access. So if you think about the pandemic hitting, schools closing, everyone going fully remote, that's 30% of students that woke up the next day unable to learn. And while this impacts households and families across the US and all 50 states, we see that it most impacts low-income households, households that are Black households, Latinx households, Native American households, and also impacts rural communities most compared with some of the urban ones. And then we sought to understand, why do people lack access? And it really came down to three main barriers. So one, around availability of infrastructure. Is there the coverage and at the relevant requisite service quality for people to connect? The second being around affordability, ensuring that the low cost offerings exist and that programs were subsidized or funds exist to subsidize so that households could afford both internet and devices. And then really about addressing a wide range of adoption barriers. And as you mentioned, we did some research with Comcast, and coming back to what Daniel said, actually focusing on programs like Chicago Connected, which offered in many ways a test case to say, okay, these are options where, or programs where we know internet's available, we know it's being offered for free because organizations or districts or public entities are sponsoring service, and we know students need it for learning. Why are they still not connected? And when you look at that, there's really a range of issues in play. There's a lot of issues around information. People don't understand if they're eligible or what the program is, or how to apply or how to adopt. You hear stories of people saying, I was afraid to plug the internet into the wall, afraid it would. And so you're working also with a very low level of digital literacy. And then there are also a lot of issues around trust. It is a new concept. You have to give information, social security number, and you may not be comfortable doing that for immigration status or just debt collectors, or a range of concerns around the government. And also trust around what's the quality of service, which you often find, for example, when there are free programs, about people being concerned, if it's free, it must be low quality. And so I think the key is that everybody plays a role in solving this. This is a really unique issue in that no individual can solve it on their own, no organization, no entity can solve it on their own. And we have seen you need the government to be allocating money to this across all three of those root causes, and also policies to support it. You need districts that can communicate with students and be a node for information, both gathering. You need community organizations like Kids for Chicago and many others that can be there and holding the hands of people, both to help them walk through the process of getting online and teaching them how to use it in the digital skills. We talked to folks in Chicago and in the Chicago Connected program who said, we would not be where we are today if it were not for this network. I think Daniel can probably speak to it more, of more than 40 organizations that are there to hold the hand and to really help people. And you see that true across the country. And then organizations like all of yours who are here today, I think play a vital role in keeping the pulse on the issue and being able to conduct research to say who lacks access and why, what are the pockets, what are the solutions and interventions that work for a specific population, and also what's the benefit of this. Because I think there but because of what it unlocks for society. It's critical to equity and inclusion. It's critical to unlocking demand and growth across sectors in education, workforce development, healthcare, civic engagement, and then key to really driving that next generation of economic growth. And so I think that there is a role of research providers like all of yours and the public to be able to say, what is that benefit? What is the reason to continue investing to ensure that every household in the US has access to broadband?
Well, thank you very much, Hannah. We appreciate it. And next, we're going to turn to Christopher Mitchell, who's the Director of Community Broadband Networks Initiative with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. He also runs muninetworks.org, a comprehensive online clearinghouse of information about local policies to improve internet access, helped found Next Century Cities, and served as Director of Policy for the first 5 years. His awards are long. I'll simply mention the Coalition for Local Internet Choice gave him the Indispensable Award, and he received one of the 2012 Top 25 in Public Sector Technology by Government Technology. So, Chris, thank you very much, and take it away.
Thank you, Paul. And I'm going to give comments that are a little bit less focused on community solutions than I normally do, given this audience. But I do want to start by noting most of my work is focused on how communities can solve these problems, how local governments are well positioned, a history of how local governments have stepped up with many different models and that sort of a thing. But I think it would be more useful for this audience to talk a little bit about why, one of the reasons why, one that I think would be more persuasive. And that's that we don't have good data on just about anything in broadband. The information that has been cited previously on the call is as good as it gets in our area in many ways. The ACS data, American Community Survey, which also has numerous flaws as people are self-reporting things that they don't understand very well. The Federal Communications Commission has decided to blind itself. It's refused to collect accurate data. The FCC's data on where broadband is such a joke that its own commissioners refuse to defend it, and they basically argue more about how to fix it or how to kick the can down the road, such that when the pandemic came, you have people in school districts who are trying to figure out how many kids in our city don't have home internet access. And it's a guess. It's a guess that has a large error margin. And so not only did you not know how bad the problem was, it wasn't clear when you'd solved it. And I mean, we still hear this word that pops up when we're talking about students in schools, which is that they disappeared. And that's not a language that I ever wanted to hear in my own country, that people are disappearing and we don't know where they went, whether or not they're still meeting their educational needs, or anything else. And I think that this is a real problem. The states can do a better job. In fact, when the federal government was claiming that about 3-4% of people in Georgia did not have the availability of broadband access, the state did a much more in-depth study. Other states are copying that to their credit, and they found it was closer to about 10%. That's a significant difference there that gives you a sense of what needs to be done. Even then, we don't actually know anything about pricing. And so as we get more data on where a service is available, if we don't know whether it's priced at $40 a month or $80 a month, we're not going to be able to make intelligent decisions about whether it's adequate, about why families aren't using it. And so for a group like this that I think takes data seriously, perhaps more seriously than most other people, I think that it's important to note that we do not have good data, and it has to be a big part of the effort moving forward if we want to seriously tackle this problem. And an example that I'll use right now is that the federal government is focused on served versus unserved. Even as we look at the potentially $40 billion that we distributed in the infrastructure, the jobs bill, the infrastructure bill that's being negotiated, there's this idea of served versus unserved. And I can use the example of Baltimore whenever I speak about this, because in Baltimore, Comcast credibly says that it can deliver a gigabit to any address. And I think that they're correct. There might be 1%, 2% of Baltimore that that's not true for. And yet half of the kids in the Baltimore schools were not able to get online at the beginning of the pandemic. So you can't tell me that Baltimore is served. We're using awful definitions. They're not relevant for what we're actually trying to accomplish. And we need to be very serious about holding policymakers' feet to the fire as we're fixing that. So as I bring this back to local solutions, my argument has been that so long as the federal government doesn't know where the problem is, doesn't know which families it impacts, the states often don't have any better idea, although they do have some better idea because they hear a little bit more, they're a little closer to the people. We need to make sure that the key government actor that's taking action on this is the local governments. Local governments have to be empowered to create the digital inclusion work that Angela will talk about in a second. They need to be empowered to be a part of the solution in the infrastructure spending. Their voices really need to be heard because they are the ones hearing on a regular basis from businesses and residents as to where the problem is. And we don't have a data set. Even as the FCC improves its game, we are not going to have a data set in the next 12 months from what I can tell. And that might even be might be laughing in 12 months about how far we are away from a better data set. So it's not super great news, but the Q&A I think is going to be more fun. So I'm looking forward to that. Thank you all.
Thank you, Chris. And our last panelist is Angela Seifer, the Executive Director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. She was one of the founders of NDIA in 2015, but she's been working the field since 1997. She's gone from extremes as helping physically set up computer labs in underserved areas to testifying to Congress. So she also has a long series of awards. I think the most likely one to highlight is Government Tech Magazine named her one of their top 25 doers, dreamers, and drivers of 2019. So on that note, Angela, look forward to hearing your take.
Thanks, Paul. I really love hearing the variety of folks that you've brought here today, and that we have folks like Ryan who are like, yeah, I made some people mad. Like, that's how we're gonna make change, right? Because we're not gonna do it if we're like, oh, everybody loves me. So fun discussion. So about 7 years ago, as Paul said, we created the National Digital Inclusion Alliance because there wasn't an entity representing digital inclusion programs. So now we have an entity representing digital inclusion programs, right? And we did that because that work is very local. It is very grassroots. There, until now, has been no support from the federal government. That's hopefully, like in this mysterious infrastructure package, if it ever happens, maybe that changes and we have some significant support. Maybe we'll have some significant support from the federal government. But when I say digital inclusion, what I'm talking about are the activities that get us to digital equity. These are the two definitions we came up with when we first started NDIA. So digital equity is individuals, communities having full access to information communication technology to do whatever it is they need to do. And then digital inclusion are the activities that get us there. And digital inclusion is that affordable home broadband that everyone's talking about, the devices, because the mobile phone doesn't cut it, the digital literacy skills, the tech support, the application support. It's all those pieces where those of us who have resources, we have folks in our lives that we can turn to help us with those things. And I think that kind of human side of it is something we saw very clearly during the pandemic. And Hannah's research really dove into this, and we're a huge fan of what she came up with and has shared out. Because if we don't have that human side addressed and we're just like, hey, here's a hotspot. Well, sometimes the hotspot doesn't get turned on and folks are like, I don't know why I didn't get turned on. Well, having a bunch of us be like, I don't know why I didn't get turned on is really insufficient, right? And that's why I'm constantly telling people to look at Chicago. Because in Chicago, they, from the beginning, Daniel and his folks were like, we have to find community-based organizations who are on the ground, who are already trusted, who can help us sign folks up. that was brilliant. And I am constantly saying, who's the model? Chicago, right? Because they did that from the very beginning. And that's not generally how it works, as Hannah's research has shown us. It happens later, right? They throw a bunch of hotspots out and like, what are we going to do now? But we have to look at that from the beginning. And Chris's research gets into that too. Like, we can't address affordability later. We can't address digital literacy later. We need to do it while we're figuring out availability. So all these folks are perfect, Paul, that you have gathered here together. And my last thought for everyone is that this possible money that we have coming and the money that's already there from the COVID support, these are all opportunities for local and state governments, right? There's never going to be another opportunity like this ever again. This is a once in a lifetime for all of us. So now is the moment, and which is why all of these folks work around the clock, because now is the moment for those local and state governments to figure out what their plans are now. Because if that infrastructure package happens and we're all like biting our nails thinking it might really happen, there's even more money coming for us to utilize to have that huge impact that we all want to have at the local level. Okay, Paul, back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Angela. That's a good final comment from the panelists. But just to ask a question to kick off the discussion, clearly we all recognize the American Recovery Act and the pending infrastructure bill is going to present some federal funding opportunities. Just to get your responses on how that can help, but also incidentally, to maybe leapfrog off Chris's point, if there are other ways the federal government can help local and state governments deal with this. The mapping and data front is an obvious factor for GRA members, but want to hear about your perspectives on those issues. Any volunteers to go first?
Jumping in first. One of the things that I would suggest is to look at what California's just done. I don't know that the governor signed it yet, but they have, from the point of view of availability, they are doing two things. One is they are building a large open access middle mile network, which means that no matter where you are in California, you will be close to a place where you can get a high quality internet connection. That would be like at a wholesale level that you'd be able to then distribute, whether you're an ISP, a community, or something else. This is crucial, and especially in areas that have a lot of Indian country, because many tribes are not near a good backhaul, is what we call it, or middle mile for internet access. The other piece of what California is doing is, I think, really smart, which is that they have created a loan loss reserve fund, which is probably one of the few places I don't actually have to explain what this is. But it makes local bonding and borrowing a lot easier on local governments, which we're very excited to see how more rural and smaller local governments are able to take advantage of this to help build some of the needed infrastructure. And they may be doing that in partnership with others. They may do it themselves, but it's going to be exciting to watch in the near future.
Go ahead, Angela. You go. I'll jump in after you.
Okay. Just to point out for folks who are new to this whole broadband business, in the American Rescue Plan, there's money went to Treasury, right? To Treasury to distribute to local and state governments for them to use for whatever it is they need to use it for. And in that, when the Treasury came out with their interim final rules, we don't have final rules yet, but we have guidance now. There's a section on broadband as to what's possible, but there's also a section on assistance to households. And in that assistance to households, it says internet access and digital literacy. And so there has been some confusion that local and state governments couldn't use those funds for helping households to pay for internet service, for digital literacy support, for digital navigators, because it doesn't fall in the broadband section, but it doesn't need to fall in the broadband section because it can fall in under the assistance to households section. So I think that's an opportunity, and then the potential new money is an opportunity. And I think the big thing to be figuring out right now is what are the assets on the ground so that we can utilize that money more effectively. And that's essentially what Kids for Chicago did, was go out and figure who was already doing this work, and then to further build up the digital literacy support in Chicago.
Yeah, and I'll take a slight piggyback off of that, Angela, and I think there's a conversation we need to have about that particular categorization of funding with the city of Chicago, because I think we've actually run into that potential hazard of not thinking dollars can be used. And the intent of the Chicago Connected program is to have it extend as indefinitely if possible. But I think to some of the things that Christopher was saying from a local governance standpoint, we're a parent advocacy standpoint. Like our change, our unit of change is the family, the actual household. And we believe that they, given that they're the most directly impacted by any of these systems, whether it's education or housing or whatever, need to be part of the conversation. So, you know, I'm a big proponent of how do you go even a level deeper than local governments? And I think local governments can do this. But when you're designing solutions, how do you design solutions that take into account those perspectives so that they actually work? Because one of the things I worry about when it's being designed from on high is that it gets too prescriptive too quickly. And we see this a little bit with Chicago Connected. Like we've designed a program that works for our particular context, but suddenly it doesn't match up with whatever the federal government or whoever says the program has to do X, Y, and Z in order for you to get funded. And then, you know, we have 64,000 kids already who are on this program and they're suddenly not eligible, even though they are exactly the demographic that the federal government's trying to support. So there has to be some thinking that goes into how do you make sure that those directly impacted or local governments do have a role in thinking through. So however prescriptive it's going to be, the less confining it is, the better.
Thanks very much. And just to ask a question before we shift to the audience Q&A, something that comes up frequently in our conversations on the topic is some confusion about 5G technology and somehow rendering the need for broadband access completely moot. I think there's consumer confusion over the advertising campaign around 5G technology for wireless providers and the implications for like remote schooling. If some of you could speak to that, I think that would probably help those of us involved in a community conversation.
I'm very happy to get that ball rolling to the technical geeky one here. There's been a large misinformation campaign about what 5G is and what to expect from it that at this point is over, in the sense that the big wireless mobile phone companies like AT&T, T-Mobile, and Verizon have more or less stopped with dramatic promises about 5G everywhere, and they've gotten a little bit more realistic in their filings with Wall Street and whatnot. And so we now know that 5G is not going to be in very many places delivering those super fast connections anytime soon. We know that because of the vendors who would be supplying that gear. What we are seeing is 5G that is slightly better than 4G in more rural areas with the same data bandwidth caps, with the same prices that may be out of reach for some folks. And so I think the lesson to learn is that there is no technology that is going to solve this problem. Some different technologies will help around the edges, but fundamentally, anytime you hear anyone premising a claim on the basis of a new technology is going to solve this problem, you should discount it, because it's not based in reality. Fundamentally, I would say our problems are one of poverty and powerlessness, and those are the issues that have to be addressed, not just technology.
Can I add on to that in Chris's point that there's no technology that's going to solve it, as new technologies get developed and we get all excited about what their potential is in terms of bringing us broadband service, in the past, when new technologies have come out to provide us with broadband service, they don't go to the poor neighborhoods first. So when we think about the digital divide, they don't go to rural areas first either, right? So they're leaving out the two populations that tend to be left out in our digital space. And so that alone, like that, couple that with the fact that technology isn't going to solve this problem, because there's a huge human element to this, means that nobody should be like shrugging their shoulders and walking away because they think a new technology. Satellite, same thing, right? Elon Musk is not going to solve the digital divide.
Anyone else on this before we turn to the audience question? Otherwise, Sarah, happy to turn to any audience members, either in the chat or raising their hands. So audience members, now's your time to click your hand button and be called upon to interact with this panel of experts and ask your questions directly.
Absolutely. You can also click the button that says floor on the lower right-hand part of your screen, and that will show us that you want to ask a question that way. Right now, I am not seeing any raised hands or floor chats. So if you have another question for the group, Paul, go ahead and do it.
There seems to be a question from Matt Owen.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, Hi, sorry. This is Matt Owen with Tennessee Advisory Commission. Thank you all for your presentation. I wanted to ask a question, or maybe just for a follow-up discussion from the panel, related to something that you all were just talking about, particularly with the adoption angle when it comes to broadband, and that's scalability. When it comes to programs like Daniel that you've had, and then dealing with some of the competing requirements when it comes from state or federal level. What solutions have you all found for that scalability issue when it comes to taking solutions that you can then implement or at least help other local governments with? Because that's one of the big challenges that I've found in my research is, how do you do that? How do you take someone's solution and not have it be so context specific that you can't move it anywhere else? And thank you.
And I'll just add before the panelists respond, those of you who have not looked at this issue yet, it is very particular to geographies. For instance, our city is very dense, but it has enormous topography challenges. So that's going to impact the potential results. So you're right, this is not a one size fits all. That being said, happy to have any of the panelists volunteer.
I can speak a little bit to that. Oh, Angela, are you speaking?
Can you all hear me?
Now we can hear you.
Okay. So look at what existing assets are already in that community that are providing digital inclusion services now. And I think that's don't just take what Chicago's doing and drop it into another city. Figuring out what's already happening, not just gaps, but assets. And finding the assets are not going to be super quick. You have to do a bunch of asking around, and you have to keep rephrasing the words that you're using. You can't just be like, is anybody working on digital inclusion? And then folks sometimes will be like, I don't know what those words mean, right? So are you teaching digital literacy? Are you helping folks with computers? Are you refurbishing computers? Are you taking old computers and doing something with them? So asking around to figure out what's happening. And then I think the other big piece of that is who's trusted in the community. And this is a lesson, I think, from Chicago, is that the community-based organizations that are supporting Chicago Connected are not all digital, they're not digital inclusion organizations. They're organizations that are trusted by the population that the program wants to serve. And then the program provided that support to those organizations to be able, okay, well, so what is digital inclusion then? And now those organizations do digital inclusion work, but they didn't necessarily do digital inclusion work before. And that's awesome because there's not enough organizations that have done digital inclusion work in the past. So looking at the models out there, yes, learn from Chicago, learn from all the models, right? But don't just think it's going to be pick it up and move it, because it's understanding what the barriers are and what the assets are and asking folks what they want, right? Because nothing is more annoying than having somebody come in and be like, hey, here's how you solve everything. Right?
Yeah. And I would just add to that, I think, Angela, everything you said is spot on. And an example, I worked with a municipality that's a pretty big municipality in the US. We did a survey to understand what organizations are currently supporting the range of digital inclusion needs today, from philanthropy, basic digital skills, assistance, language assistance, device access, like the whole gamut. And there was more than 100 organizations currently supporting. And so a lot of these efforts is about enablement of these organizations, giving a microphone to the organizations that are doing the best work, connecting the dots between these organizations. And so I think, as Angela said, there's a huge role to look across the US and be able to see the best practices and get inspiration for what could work, what is possible, and what might work in your community. I think NCC, Next Century Cities, has great resources. Angela and the NDIA team have great resources. Many of the state and municipality teams are starting to put their broadband plans online. And then everyone who's doing this work is so passionate about it and so willing to share because they want the best practices of their work to be replicated elsewhere. And then I think to the point of scalability, one thing that is needed across all of these municipalities is the infrastructure for these connections. And so how do you identify who's going to collect the data and how you're going to do it? Be it through surveys or speed tests or direct data assessments to be able to understand who lacks access, who doesn't, and why. How are you going to create the infrastructure so that people can coordinate initiatives and you can have a directory of what's going on so that organizations can be connected, so that households can find resources, so that you can collect feedback from what organizations and community members are seeing on the ground so that the solutions directly reflect the needs of the community. And so I think building that infrastructure and the operating model and the leadership team across public and private sectors is the key to scalability.
Daniel, I know you have your hand up as well, given Chicago's reference.
Yeah, my only quick add to this is that you need, like Angela and others on this panel play a critical role of just highlighting what's happening on the national stage. And so we've been able to look to those resources to figure out what other people are doing. But there also has to be we made a very deliberate choice early on to make anything that we did open source and put it on the site for Chicago Connected. And that actually came out of someone reaching out to us and saying they wanted to know what we did so they could repackage it and take it and I think probably sell it to other cities. And we said, well, we actually have to put some resources and dedicate them to making this just available. So for anybody, we've had conversations with folks in Tennessee about some of the work that's happening out of Chattanooga, but and I'm not sure if that's where the gentleman Matt Owen was coming from, but I think generally, like if you're doing work in this space on a local context, like put some effort into making sure it's available to people so they can just go find it for free wherever it is, because that's where the best learning happens.
And open to other audience questions if there's a hand or anything on the floor. Otherwise,
there's nothing on the floor, and I don't see anybody with their hands open.
Okay, so to shift to another question we had prepared for the panel's discussion, in terms of the access to broadband, obviously education is a major factor right now from a short-term problem standpoint. I say that as a father whose high school student has been remote learning. That being said, there are some pretty interesting long-term implications here, particularly for issues like employer location decisions and even with residential home sales and where people choose to live long-term relative to broadband access. I wonder if some of you might want to provide some perspective on those sort of long-term issues that GRA members will probably be casting an eye on.
I would just say, and I think I mentioned this in my opening remarks, but digital divide and broadband access is very much not an end in and of itself, and it matters for equity, for access, for economic development. I don't have all the statistics on the top of my head right now, but many of them are out there showing that, for example, in healthcare, you see reduced stays in hospitals or better health outcomes for the people who have broadband access. In education, you see higher grade point averages and larger lifetime income for the people with access. This is replicated across sectors, and then it translates to economic development. And you see cities that have invested in broadband access. There are correlations and studies have been done on first the societal ROI on broadband access and the impact of having access that it has on increased GDP, on increased tax revenue, on lower social services costs. And then, Paul, as you said, on the business attraction, and showing that for a 10 percentage point increase in in broadband access, and I'm not going to quote the exact statistic because I don't want to get it wrong, but there is a significant increase in GDP growth that comes from the attraction and retention of growth of businesses in the region.
And which is that we may be able to develop models in which we are asking people to pay $10 or $15 a month to get access to it, which is certainly preferable to market rate or no access. But if that's a barrier, it's ridiculous for us to try to enforce that, in the sense that the value to society to have families on the internet, particularly low-income families for whom that $10 could be a barrier, that value to society is much greater than $10 a month to make sure that kids have better access to education, that parents have more access to economic opportunity and things like that. And so this is not the time, I think, to get into a big dilemma about like, oh, should a family be contributing $10 or $20? Like, let's get people connected over the next several years. Let's focus on that. And the other piece of that I can bring to it is a little bit more of the economics, which is to understand that broadband, the cost of keeping a connection alive is very low. In an urban area on a fiber network, you're looking at probably less than $10 a month. Certainly less than $10 a month if you're not including the cost of the help desk, the number of people that statistically will need help any given month. If you are, it's still less than $15 a month, certainly depending on where you are. In more rural areas, it might be a little bit more because of having to send techs out and trucks and things like that, and have to drive longer distances. But it's still like less than $20 a month or less than $25 a month. The costs that we're wrestling with are overwhelmingly one-time costs of how do we get networks built that will connect these people that will then have low operating costs. And so when you hear that broadband is expensive, it is very important to understand what we're talking about. We're often talking about a one-time cost, which gets confusing because oftentimes then it's amortized over 20 years, but it's still a one-time cost. That's a high cost relatively. And then there's a very low cost of keeping that connection alive. And so for people who care about the economics and the numbers behind this, I think it's important to design our solutions with that reality in mind.
All right, we do have a question that came through in the chat. It's from Sarah Shaw from the Wisconsin Policy Forum, and she writes, for an effort like Chicago Connected, where work is happening in such close coordination with community-based organizations, how much can a successful government philanthropic advocacy partnership in one arena, digital inclusion, open up partnership opportunities in other arenas?
That feels like Sarah's asking me the question. Hey, Sarah, how are you? Asking me the question directly, but I want to make sure I understand what she's asking. Can you repeat the last part of it? Oh, I can't hear you, Sarah. Sorry. I'll mute you.
One moment. All right. So the last part says, I'll just read the whole thing again. For an effort like Chicago Connected, where the work is happening in such close coordination with a community-based organization, how much can a successful government philanthropic advocacy partnership in one arena, in this digital inclusion in this case, open up partnership opportunities in other arenas?
Oh, I see. Yeah, it has. So in terms of the work that we're doing, and this goes back a little bit to the previous question, all of these systems intersect. And I wasn't going to dive into this because I want to be respectful of the other panelists, but the education piece, while it's a short-term solution, the reality is like 1 in 3 households have CPS students in them that are disconnected in Chicago. If you look at the data's not perfect, but directionally, that means 2 in 3 are disconnected that don't have children in them. And the ramifications of having a house on either side of you, whether you're doing remote learning or not, that don't have access to the internet in the middle of a pandemic where they don't have jobs are being lost, is pretty significant, right? The societal outcropping of that, we can go in our head and figure out where that takes us as a city. And I know that that's playing out in all kinds of places because the economics just become that much more challenging. So one of the benefits of this program has been, you're putting internet broadband access into households, and just by working with the community-based partners, they're connecting those families, not just the students, to a whole host of other resources and needs. And from that, they're also able to kind of network those people into different organizations that can provide long-term support around everything from, job hunts to healthcare to what you name it. But everything is kind of living in that space. And I don't think that that world is going to go away. And so I do think that there are a lot of relationships that have emerged purely as an outcropping of, hey, we just want to get you, remote learning started. And having the community-based organizations be a leader in that, they're naturally saying, what about these 5 other things that we can help connect your family to?
Yeah. And I would just echo that. I think one of the things that has been most inspiring around the digital divide and broadband access is just seeing, especially since the pandemic started, it became much more visible, all of the different stakeholders come together on this issue. And so you have providers working with districts on how to build a sponsored service program, a totally new program during the pandemic. You have community organizations spreading the word, providing digital support. And when I say community organizations, it's really the full gamut. It's like, how can you put flyers of information in grocery stores? How can you have the trusted sources, the faith-based organizations, the neighborhood associations putting out information, being a source of trust? And just a very tangible example of some of the similarities is looking at a lot of the work around vaccine hesitancy and vaccine acceptance. And it's the same concept of how can all of these different organizations come together to provide, be it like Uber and Lyft saying we'll give free rides to clinics, but it's the same. It's like every player thinking about what's the role that they have to play and coming together and working together around what is your expertise? How do you communicate? What to Chris was saying, what are your incentives and economics, and how can we leverage that to make you a player in this, that I think can be replicated across issues and across areas, but is, I find, a very powerful and inspiring and humbling ecosystem to see come together.
I've been struck.
And we are seeing that more so. Sorry, Chris.
No, you go ahead, and then I'll go. I'll be quick once I do.
Okay. Prior to the pandemic, we were seeing digital inclusion coalitions in that are place-based, but during the pandemic, we really saw an explosion of those. And I think that goes to what Daniel and Hannah were just saying, and that folks who are doing this, it is an ecosystem, right? And so the more we have that stronger ecosystem in all communities, the better. But if we don't know what's already there, how do we know how to fill in the gaps? And the question that was asked about leading to other philanthropic partners, I think it does, but it's important to note that there hasn't been money for digital inclusion in the past. Like this is a moment when all of a sudden there's funds on the table, and so those organizations who were doing other things are now doing digital inclusion work. Having support come from folks like Kids for Chicago and other entities that are local, but also organizations like ILSR and NDIA, that kind of support is to help them utilize those resources in the best way they can. And then it is up to that local programming to make sure it's solid, right? Like to watch for those fly-by-night, like, oh yes, we do this work, but they're not actually trusted by the community. So there is also a little bit of caution to watch for that.
And Chris, why don't you give us the last word on this before I wrap up the panel?
Whether it's in polls or conversations, I have a sense that people in areas that have a lot of problems are still prioritizing broadband as the number one issue they want to see resolved. And I think it's in part because it's discrete. It is something we can solve. It is something we can solve in a few years. Whereas education, economic development, drug policy, a lot of these things are going to be with us for a long time as we deal with public policy questions. And I think the answer to this question in my mind is in part, we need to do a good job with this. People's faith in government is legitimately, under siege. I think a lot of people are having questions about why we have all this government, what it really does for them. And solving this problem would be a really good thing to restore some faith that we can do these things collectively, and that then we can wrestle on with some other issues beyond that.
Probably can't solve the other issues unless we solve the broadband one. Like you can't solve workforce development or education if you haven't solved broadband.
That's a great way to wrap up this conversation. I really want to thank the GRA for this opportunity to present on this issue. I want to thank all of you for presenting such a wealth of perspectives to our audience. And just to build on the point Angela made about the unprecedented opportunity for local and state governments, I think this discussion illustrates there's also an unprecedented opportunity for a data-driven contribution to the discussion from the members of the GRA. So thank you all, and I'm happy to turn it back over to Sarah for the next step in the conference.
All right. Thank you, Paul.